Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 16th of November 1924, the brightest and the best gaze into their crystal balls to tell us what the next war will be like. And get it wrong. There is more correspondence on poverty, there is something odd going on in the gold market, well, according to me there is, and we learn about London's skyscrapers, or lack of them. We also learn about German Anglophobia and French driving habits. Also, what is the best way to pay for theatre tickets? Money or chocolate? But first, some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. On Tuesday, armistice commemorations, including the 2-minute silence, were held up and down the country. The Fascist Party held their own armistice meeting in Trafalgar Square on the Sunday before. The gathering was partly to honour Britain's war dead, and partly to prevent communists from celebrating the 7th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. I should hasten to add that this fascist party is not Oswald Mosley's fascist party. That is still in the future, not least because Mosley is, for the time being, a member of that well-known nursery of authoritarianism, the Labour Party. In fascist Italy, the Italian parliament has reconvened without the opposition, who are boycotting the assembly. I was told at school that they were doing so in protest at the murder of Giacomo Matteotti earlier this year, see the 22nd of June episode. But the Times makes no mention of it, focusing more on the rigged election. In the 13th of January episode, I mentioned that Hirohito, Japan's regent, had survived an assassination attempt. This week came the news that his would-be assassin had been convicted and sentenced to death. There have been further attempts to evict tenants on Clydeside in Glasgow. On Wednesday, occupants were evicted from 7 properties, and later on in the day, 6 of those properties were reoccupied by the tenants who had just been evicted. E.D. Morel, MP, has died. A socialist, he was one of the men who beat Winston Churchill at Dundee in 1922. He also recently attracted the ire of a Mr. Hitler of South Germany, see the 28th of September episode, after accusing him of taking money from the French. He was also responsible, as a journalist, for exposing Belgian treatment of natives in the Congo in the early 1900s. The subject of the Empire exhibition at Wembley is not something that interests me greatly, but it consumes a huge amount of space in the Times, so I suppose I ought to follow it a bit. The debate at the moment is whether it should be reopened next year. Spoiler alert, it will be. It seemed to me that there has been a substantial fall in the price of gold over the last week or so. It started at 90 shillings 10 pence and ended at 89 shillings 6 pence. Actually, that's a 1.5% decline, which isn't that great. But going back to May, it stood at 94 shillings 7 pence. So that's a 5% decline, which sounds substantial, well, to me at least. This could be due to the vagaries of supply and demand, or to speculation that Britain is to go back on the gold standard at the old rate, or, which by the way was 78 shillings, or insider trading, which I don't think was an offence in those days. I prefer to believe it's speculation. A fair rate for the price of gold, given wartime inflation, would be about 130 shillings. If this sounds like gobbledygook, please take a look at Professor Bath's series on the history of money. In a protest against taxation, theatres have to pay a tax that cabarets don't, the Shaftesbury Theatre announced that rather than selling tickets, they would be selling chocolates, which could be exchanged for entrance to the theatre. At least they did until the London County Council intervened and told them not to. The British Broadcasting Company, Neville Chamberlain's British Broadcasting Company, first broadcast in 1922, and this week is celebrating its 2nd anniversary. The Times marked this with a short article on how it's doing, noting that almost the whole country can now pick up its broadcasts, and that it proved very useful during the recent foot and mouth outbreak. There's been some further correspondence on the subject of skyscrapers. On Wednesday, a correspondent explained that you couldn't build tall buildings in London because of the clay underneath. I hope the owners of the Shard are aware of this. But an E. Guy Dauber, Vice President of the Royal Institution of British Architects, or RIBA, outlined other objections. Mr. Delisa Joseph's letter advocating higher buildings will not carry much conviction at a time like the present when the traffic difficulty, already very serious, is seen to be rapidly becoming worse. Each rebuilding in the centre of London adds to the congestion and to the consequent waste of time, which constitutes a heavy loss to the community. I need only point out that New York architects who come here, including Mr. Cass Gilbert, the architect of the Woolworth Building, the tallest building in the world at the time, and many others who know the subject intimately, warn us to let the height of London alone and not to repeat the blunders that they have made over there. I would dearly like to know what sort of blunders people think the New Yorkers are making, but Dorber does not elaborate. A number of times I have mentioned the problems of London traffic. London is not alone, with Paris having similar problems and different problems. One such different problem is with traffic control. It is indeed not uncommon to see an agent de police leave his post to remonstrate with a taxicab driver who has dared to defy him, and leave the traffic to look after itself while he engages in a long argument on the finer points of traffic regulation. And what of those taxicab drivers? The nerve and the skill of the Paris taxi driver is something to marvel at. He will swing at top speed out of a side street into a main thoroughfare and twist and turn through fast-going traffic with an apparent recklessness which makes one gasp. I sometimes think that in 1924 the rest of the world existed mainly to demonstrate how much better Britain was. In last week's episode, I mentioned the importance of shame in keeping people away from seeking state assistance. This week, a letter from a George Hamilton, who 20 years previously had led a commission on the Poor Law, reinforced that. From the standpoint of public morality and independence, it is inadvisable to diminish the existing apathy, we would say reluctance, of the individual to becoming a pauper through the acceptance of relief from the rates. On the other hand, the prejudice against relief under poor law superintendence does deter many infirm and helpless persons from receiving the assistance which is ready at hand and specially established for their benefit. He goes on to recommend that for the sake of efficiency the poor law be combined with councils, and that there should be some amalgamation of poor law boards. I was going to introduce this next section with the phrase, the war to end all wars, and then I thought, I've never heard that phrase in the Times, either during the war or after. Is it of more recent origin, perhaps? It turns out it wasn't. It originates with a book by H.G. Wells entitled The War That Will End War, first published in 1914. Well, whatever the case may be, the Times of 1924 certainly didn't set much store by it. On Monday, their own correspondent in Berlin wrote an article. After speculating on what wireless rays might do, he said this: "From the evidence available, it is much more probable that the attention of German military experts is at present concentrated upon the cooperation of aeroplanes, tanks and gas, especially gas." Experts, eh? Well, I suppose 2 out of 3 ain't bad. This prompted a reply from one Basil Liddell Hart, future Times military correspondent. The gas manual with which he, the Times correspondent, deals is but one manifestation of views that are not restricted to a small circle of chemical warfare enthusiasts, but permeate the whole current of Germany's military thought. He went on to explain how the French are reluctant to be the first to use gas. But the German regulations treat the use of gas as a matter of course, without any qualification, and its tactical employment both in attack and defence is fully dealt with. A study of their manuals leaves a strong impression that gas is regarded by the German military authorities as their principal future means of redressing their inferiority in numbers of troops and in the more orthodox military weapons. A force multiplier, as we would say today. He then talks about the ease of gas production before saying this: "Nor does it require the prolonged training of a large personnel, as do missile weapons, which demand an expert aim to hit the target effectively." This is extraordinary. By the end of the First World War, most gas was being delivered in shells, a missile weapon. I find it extraordinary that little Hart would be unaware of this. I'm also far from sure that it takes longer to train a man to shoot than it takes to train him to put on a gas mask. Little Hart then partly redeems himself. I would only add that the keynote of the German post-war doctrine is surprise, a word incessantly repeated throughout their manuals. Well, he's right there. From the Ardennes to Barbarossa to the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were constantly trying to surprise their enemies and often succeeded. Not that it did them much good. While indulging in this crystal ball gazing, the Times also reminded its readers of one aspect of how the previous war had come about. Nobody who lived in Germany before the war could fail to be impressed by the subtle influences which constantly suggested that Germany could not long remain cramped for space, that her future lay beyond the seas, that a great selfish and decadent island kingdom, that's us, alone stood between her and her true destiny of world power. Talking of the war, Wickham Steed, who was editor of The Times, has published his memoirs. He reported this remark by French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau on American President Woodrow Wilson. "Talk to Wilson?" exclaimed the old tiger. "How can I talk to a fellow who thinks himself the first man for 2,000 years who has known anything about peace on earth? Wilson imagines that he is a second Messiah. He believes he has been sent to give peace to the world, and that his preconceived notions are the only notions worth having." Anyway, that's all for this week. At this point, I believe I'm supposed to say something about liking and subscribing, if you're logged in, that is. In the meantime, I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.